Imagine a ruler so consumed by ambition and greed that he saw an entire nation not as a people to govern, but as a personal source of wealth. This was Leopold I of Belgium, who, in the late 19th century, claimed the Congo Free State as his own private domain. Unlike other colonies controlled by European governments, the Congo under Leopold was treated as his personal estate, a place where profits mattered more than human life. The story of his reign is a chilling tale of exploitation, injustice, and the resilience of those who suffered under his rule. From the moment Leopold set his sights on the Congo, his intentions were clear: to extract the immense natural wealth of the region, including rubber, ivory, and minerals, without concern for the people who lived there. He employed explorers, signed treaties under misleading terms, and established a private army to enforce his control. The Congolese were subjected to forced labor, harsh punishments, and unimaginable hardships, all to fuel the king's desire for wealth and influence in Europe. But the Congo story is not just one of suffering. It is also a story of courage, of people who resisted oppression and fought to preserve their dignity. Brave individuals, from local communities to international activists, began to expose the truth about life in the Congo Free State. Their reports would eventually ignite outrage across the world, proving that even the darkest chapters of history can be challenged when voices refuse to be silenced. Today, as we explore the story of Leopold I and the Congo, we will uncover the human cost of unchecked power and the lessons it holds for us all. We will look at the mechanisms of control he used, the devastating impact on communities, and the resilience of those who fought back. This is a history that deserves attention, not only to remember the past, but also to understand how history shapes our present and informs the future. If you want to journey with us into this gripping story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapter. Together, we will uncover the truths that history sometimes tries to hide, learn from them, and reflect on the enduring human spirit that can rise even in the face of extreme adversity. Stay with us as we begin this exploration into the Congo Free State, a land transformed by ambition, marked by suffering, and remembered through the courage of those who endured it. This is the story of Leopold I, his power, his influence, and the lives forever changed under his reign. As Leopold I's ambitions in the Congo Free State grew, the people who lived there found themselves trapped in a world where their daily survival was measured against impossible demands, and failure came at a horrifying cost. Entire communities were forced into relentless labor, harvesting rubber, collecting ivory, and digging for minerals under the watchful eyes of armed overseers. The Congolese were no longer seen as human beings with families, traditions, and dreams, but as tools to extract wealth, and any hesitation or inability to meet the quotas set by Leopold's administration was met with brutal punishment. Women, and even children, were subjected to acts of violence meant to instill fear and absolute obedience, leaving behind scars both physical and emotional that would endure for generations. The most infamous of these punishments involved the removal of hands or other forms of mutilation, acts intended not only as retribution, but also as a grim warning to neighbors that failure was not an option. Villages were held hostage, forced to provide the necessary labor under threat of death or permanent injury, creating a climate where distrust and terror became the daily reality, and ordinary life was nearly impossible to maintain. Leopold's private army, the Force Publique, became the instrument of this terror, enforcing compliance with ruthless efficiency. These soldiers, trained and empowered by the king himself, would move through the dense jungles and riverine villages, ensuring that quotas were met and punishing those who could not comply. Families were torn apart as men were beaten or executed for falling short, and women and children suffered alongside them, sometimes witnessing atrocities that would haunt their memories forever. The labor itself was grueling, performed under oppressive heat, in swampy forests, and on treacherous terrain where disease and exhaustion claimed as many lives as the punishments. Every day became a test of endurance and survival. And yet, despite the unimaginable hardships, the Congolese continued to resist in whatever ways they could, finding strength in community, faith, and the hope that one day the world would know of their suffering. Even as reports of these abuses began to seep beyond the Congo, Leopold maintained a carefully constructed image of benevolence, portraying himself as a civilizing force who brought progress, religion, and education to the people of Africa. This public image clashed violently with the reality on the ground, where the Congolese experienced a regime of terror, hunger, and forced labor that decimated populations and disrupted centuries-old cultural practices. Villages were emptied, traditional leadership structures dismantled, and families were left fractured, with children growing up in fear and uncertainty. The human toll was staggering, with estimates suggesting that millions lost their lives, not only from direct acts of violence but also from disease, famine, and the collapse of social and economic systems caused by relentless exploitation. Each rubber shipment and ivory crate sent to Europe carried with it the suffering of those who had been forced to provide it, turning everyday commodities into symbols of human endurance in the face of systematic cruelty. Amid this darkness, acts of courage and resistance emerged. Some communities attempted to flee, hiding in forests or along riverbanks to escape the grasp of the force publique, while others found subtle ways to resist through sabotage or by slowing production without incurring the full wrath of their overseers. These small, persistent acts of defiance demonstrated an extraordinary resilience, a refusal to be entirely broken despite the overwhelming power of Leopold's machinery of exploitation. Outside the Congo, courageous individuals began to uncover and document these realities. Journalists, missionaries, and activists started piecing together the fragmented stories of suffering, bringing attention to a tragedy that Leopold had hoped would remain hidden from the world. Their work eventually became the catalyst for international outrage, shining a light on the grim consequences of unchecked ambition and the profound human cost of treating an entire nation as a private resource. Through these stories of forced labor, mutilation, and survival, the true scale of Leopold I's impact on the Congo becomes impossible to ignore. It is a tale not just of cruelty and oppression, but also of the resilience of the human spirit, the enduring strength of communities under extreme duress, and the power of truth to challenge injustice. By understanding the lives affected by this period, we are reminded of the importance of accountability, awareness, and the moral imperative to protect human dignity, even in the face of overwhelming power and greed. Beneath the dense canopy of the Congo's vast forests and along the winding courses of its mighty rivers, an empire of extraction was quietly, relentlessly unfolding, fueled by the personal ambitions of Leopold I of Belgium. The riches of the land rubber that could bend and stretch across continents, ivory gleaming from the tusks of elephants, copper that gleamed under European furnaces, and diamonds hidden deep within the earth became the very lifeblood of Leopold's wealth, harvested at a staggering human cost. To the king, these were not the treasures of a people but raw materials to be transformed into personal fortune, and he spared no effort to ensure that every branch tapped, every tusk gathered, every mine excavated, directly increased his opulent lifestyle in Europe. Laborers, often men and women who had never seen the world beyond their villages, were thrust into relentless toil, their days measured by quotas designed to extract maximum profit with no regard for exhaustion, illness, or injury. The Congo, once a land of vibrant communities and rich traditions, became a stage where the suffering of millions was quietly translated into cargoes bound for distant markets. Each crate of rubber, each bar of copper, each parcel of diamonds a silent testimony to lives uprooted and destroyed. The collection of rubber, for instance, was not a simple matter of gathering sap. It demanded long journeys into perilous forests, climbing and cutting vines with tools that could easily wound, all while facing the ever-present threat of violent oversight. Falling short of expectations could mean mutilation, imprisonment, or death, and entire villages were held accountable for the output of their people, amplifying the climate of fear. Every hunting carried its own burdens, as elephants were driven to near extinction while hunters risked injury or worse in confrontations with these powerful creatures. Copper and diamonds required excavation deep into the earth, often in treacherous conditions, exposing laborers to collapse, disease, and starvation. Yet for Leopold, each of these endeavors represented only opportunity, wealth flowing to him with little recognition of the suffering it entailed. The more the Congolese produced, the more his reputation in Europe as a sophisticated, enlightened ruler grew, masking the grim reality of coercion and bloodshed that lay at the heart of his enterprise. The human toll of this relentless extraction was staggering, yet it unfolded in a way that often made the king seem untouchable. Stories of villages emptied, families fractured, and communities stripped of their livelihoods circulated quietly among those who had witnessed them. But the scale of the exploitation was so immense that it seemed almost abstract to those far from the Congo. Nevertheless, courage and resistance persisted, as local leaders and ordinary villagers alike sought ways to survive, to evade the worst excesses of forced labor, or to document the injustices that they endured. Their resilience formed the undercurrent of hope in a narrative dominated by exploitation, hinting that even in the face of overwhelming oppression, the human spirit could find ways to resist, endure, and eventually bear witness. As international awareness grew through the meticulous reporting of journalists and missionaries, the stark contrast between Leopold's European image and the reality in the Congo became undeniable. Accounts of brutal punishments, failed quotas, and the sheer scale of the human suffering attached to the extraction of rubber, ivory, copper, and diamonds captured the imagination and outrage of the world. Activists such as Edmundi, Morel and Roger Casement pieced together the fragmented stories of survivors, connecting the seemingly isolated reports of abuse into a clear pattern of systemic exploitation designed to enrich one man at the expense of millions. These revelations ultimately laid the groundwork for the global pressure that would end Leopold's personal control over the Congo. But the scars left on the land and its people endured for decades, shaping the social, economic, and cultural fabric of the nation. The tale of these resources, rubber stretching across industrial belts, ivory carved into ornamental displays, copper melted in furnaces, and diamonds adorning European crowns, serves as a stark reminder of the human cost behind wealth built on exploitation. It is a story not only of greed but of endurance, of communities that survived in spite of impossible demands, and of a world gradually learning to recognize injustice through the tireless efforts of those who refused to let the suffering remain invisible. The Congo's wealth, extracted so ruthlessly, became both the measure of Leopold's power and the symbol of the resilience of those who endured, demonstrating that behind every material treasure lies a human story waiting to be told, remembered, and learned from. By the time Leopold's grip on the Congo had fully tightened, the land itself seemed to weep under the weight of relentless exploitation, and the human toll became almost incomprehensible. The Congolese population, once estimated at around 20 million, had been reduced by half, leaving barely 10 million souls to navigate a world torn apart by violence, famine, and disease. Every forest and river bore witness to the consequences of forced labor, as communities were stripped of their ability to sustain themselves, their homes emptied, and their food sources disrupted by the demands of Leopold's administration. Villages that had thrived for generations found themselves fragmented, families scattered, and local economies destroyed, as men, women, and children were conscripted to harvest rubber, collect ivory, or dig for copper and diamonds under grueling conditions that left them exhausted and vulnerable to illness. Starvation became an ever-present threat, for the demands of labor left little time for cultivating crops or securing sufficient sustenance, while disease spread rapidly among populations weakened by hunger, overwork, and inadequate shelter. Violence was woven into the daily fabric of life, not as sporadic or isolated incidents, but as a systematic method of control. The force publique, Leopold's private army, patrolled the villages with precision and brutality, ensuring that quotas were met and punishing any deviation with a severity designed to terrify entire communities into compliance. Tales of mutilation, public executions, and hostage-taking became grim realities, sending shockwaves through families and neighbors alike. Men who failed to gather sufficient rubber might never return home, while women and children were left to witness the consequences, instilling fear and a chilling obedience that stretched across miles of Congo's dense forests. Disease followed closely in the wake of violence and famine. Smallpox, sleeping sickness, and other illnesses spread rapidly among populations weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion, multiplying the number of lives lost and leaving survivors to grieve not only for loved ones, but for the destruction of the social bonds that had long held their communities together. Even as the death toll mounted, the suffering was compounded by the psychological weight of constant oppression. Children grew up under the shadow of terror, learning fear as a daily companion, while parents navigated impossible choices between meeting quotas and protecting their families. Traditional ways of life were disrupted, cultural practices abandoned, and generations lost the guidance and wisdom that had once connected them to the land and to one another. Amid these horrors, the resilience of the Congolese people shone through in quiet, often overlooked acts: villagers hiding in forests to evade conscription, elders passing down knowledge under the cover of night, communities finding ways to sustain one another even as their numbers dwindled. These acts of endurance, though small against the overwhelming machinery of exploitation, became the lifelines that allowed their culture and memory to survive despite the staggering loss of life. Internationally, the dramatic population decline could no longer remain hidden. Journalists, missionaries, and activists pieced together accounts from survivors and observers, documenting the grim statistics and the heart-wrenching human stories behind them. Edmund D. Morrell's relentless reporting exposed the scale of exploitation, linking the rubber, ivory, copper, and diamond trade to the catastrophic loss of life, while Roger Casement's reports provided irrefutable evidence of systematic abuse. Their work revealed the stark contrast between Leopold's public persona as a benevolent monarch and the catastrophic consequences of his private ambitions, compelling the world to confront a tragedy that had been hidden for too long. The story of the Congolese population halving under Leopold's rule is not merely a statistic. It is a testament to the devastating impact of unchecked ambition, the fragility of communities under extreme oppression, and the extraordinary resilience of those who endured. It serves as a stark reminder of the human cost behind wealth extracted through violence and coercion, and the importance of remembering the lives lost, the cultures disrupted, and the courage of survivors. As we reflect on this dark chapter, we are reminded that behind every number lies a human story, and in understanding the scale of loss, we can better appreciate the enduring spirit of the Congolese people and the lessons history offers about justice, accountability, and the preservation of human dignity. While the forests of the Congo echoed with the suffering of its people, Leopold I carefully curated an image far removed from the reality on the ground, presenting himself to the world as a benevolent, enlightened ruler whose mission was to bring civilization, Christianity, and progress to a land he claimed was in need of guidance. Publicly, he spoke of philanthropy, scientific exploration, and the moral duty of European powers to uplift the backward societies of Africa, framing his ambitions as acts of generosity and stewardship rather than exploitation. The establishment of the International African Association, a supposed philanthropic organization, was one of many tools he used to reinforce this image. Inviting explorers, diplomats, and observers to witness the civilizing work he claimed to be undertaking. In reality, these carefully constructed appearances masked a systematic campaign of extraction and oppression, with millions of Congolese forced into grueling labor to supply rubber, ivory, copper, and diamonds for the king's personal fortune. The contrast between the public narrative and the hidden atrocities was stark. While Europe lauded a monarch for his supposed humanitarian vision, villages in the Congo were emptied, families fractured, and communities subjected to terror and deprivation. Leopold's genius, if it can be called that, lay in his ability to manipulate perception. Using charm, intelligence, and political skill to gain the support of influential figures both in Belgium and abroad, he invited dignitaries to observe selected parts of the Congo, showing them model villages and missions carefully staged to suggest progress and benevolence. While the broader population endured unimaginable hardship, reports of atrocities that did surface were often dismissed or downplayed, labeled as exaggerations or misunderstandings, allowing the king to continue his extraction of wealth with minimal interference. This duality, an image of civility in Europe versus a reign of terror in the Congo, enabled Leopold to maintain his power and continue his private accumulation of resources while the world remained largely unaware of the scale of suffering. Even as rumors and reports began to trickle back to Europe, Leopold's control over the narrative allowed him to maintain credibility, casting critics as sensationalists or ideologues seeking to undermine his noble work. He portrayed his forced labor policies as necessary steps to teach industriousness, to instill discipline, and to bring economic development to a supposedly uncivilized population, all while personally profiting from the harsh conditions under which Congolese laborers toiled. Villages were punished if quotas were not met, entire families were threatened or harmed, and yet to the outside world, Leopold appeared as a visionary, a man bringing progress to the heart of Africa. The stark irony was that every act of cruelty, every punishment, and every death that ensured compliance with labor quotas simultaneously built the king's public reputation as a humanitarian and a civilizer. Leopold's ability to maintain this image speaks to a broader truth about power and perception. Control over how the world sees you can be as potent as control over those directly under your rule. While Congolese communities faced mutilation, disease, and death, Europe witnessed a monarch dedicated to improvement, scientific study, and moral obligation. This careful orchestration of appearances delayed international outrage and allowed decades of exploitation to occur before activists, journalists, and missionaries successfully exposed the truth. The tension between image and reality under Leopold's rule underscores how narratives can be weaponized to conceal injustice, and how appearances can mask a reality far more devastating than anyone might imagine. Yet even in this darkness, the resilience of the Congolese people persisted, and the eventual exposure of Leopold's duplicity revealed not only the truth of the atrocities, but also the courage of those who risked everything to bring the world's attention to the suffering. By examining this calculated manipulation of public perception alongside the tangible suffering of millions, we gain insight into the profound human cost of ambition unchecked by accountability and the power of truth to challenge even the most carefully maintained illusions. Leopold's reign in the Congo stands as a testament to both the dangers of concentrated power and the enduring importance of vigilance, awareness, and the courage to confront deception wherever it thrives. Amid the sprawling forests and winding rivers of the Congo Free State, an apparatus of fear operated with unrelenting precision, ensuring that Leopold II's will was executed without question, and that the people he considered his subjects had no choice but to comply. This was the Force Publique, a private army established to enforce labor quotas, suppress resistance, and maintain absolute control over the Congolese population. They were the instruments of a terror designed to make every village, every family, and every individual acutely aware of the consequences of defiance or failure. Stories circulated of men and women returning from the rubber forests missing limbs, proof that quotas had not been met, and entire villages held hostage until sufficient labor or tribute was delivered. The methods were gruesome, yet they were methodically applied, leaving no room for escape and no avenue for negotiation. Each act of violence was carefully calculated to instill fear, to break the will of the people, and to ensure that compliance became not a choice, but an unavoidable reality. The Force Publique was not merely a military force. It was the embodiment of Leopold's power in the Congo, a constant, visible threat that underscored the stakes of every action taken by the Congolese. Patrols moved through villages with discipline and ruthlessness, monitoring production, enforcing quotas, and punishing infractions in ways that ensured the community understood the price of disobedience. Hands were severed as proof of enforcement, a horrific symbol meant to convey the futility of resistance. Families lived under constant threat, knowing that failure of one member could bring suffering upon many, and the fear of collective punishment became a tool as powerful as any weapon. Those who resisted or attempted to flee were hunted, captured, and subjected to displays of brutality meant to serve as cautionary tales, reinforcing the king's dominion and the inescapable reach of his private army. The psychological impact of such tactics was profound, as communities were forced into an unnatural rhythm dictated by quotas rather than seasons, by labor rather than survival. Children witnessed the consequences of failing to meet production goals, learning from a young age that human life and dignity were subordinated to the extraction of resources. The Congolese were not only working under extreme physical duress, but they were also navigating an environment steeped in terror, where every decision carried potential consequences of unimaginable severity. Disease and famine compounded the suffering, as weakened bodies could not sustain the labor demanded. Yet the Force Publique showed no leniency, their discipline unwavering and their methods indiscriminate. Even in the midst of these horrors, acts of subtle resistance persisted. Some communities devised ways to slow production without drawing lethal attention, hiding resources or feigning illness, while others sought refuge in forests or along riverbanks, evading the reach of patrols. These acts, though small in scale against the formidable machinery of enforcement, were critical expressions of defiance and humanity in a system designed to erase both. Outside the Congo, brave journalists and missionaries began to document these realities, piecing together the scattered reports of mutilations, hostage-taking, and enforced labor to reveal the systematic nature of Leopold's control. Their work exposed the stark contrast between the public image of the king as a benevolent ruler and the everyday horrors faced by millions under his private army, generating global awareness and eventually spurring international pressure for reform. The Force Publique, in its terrifying efficiency, serves as both a symbol of the absolute power wielded by a single individual and a testament to the resilience of those who endured it. It illustrates how fear can be institutionalized, how violence can be methodically employed to extract compliance, and how communities can survive, adapt, and resist even under the most oppressive circumstances. By understanding the role of this army in the Congo Free State, we not only confront the scale of human suffering inflicted in the pursuit of wealth, but also recognize the courage and endurance of the Congolese people, whose resilience ultimately contributed to the exposure of these atrocities and the eventual dismantling of Leopold's personal dominion. The story of the force publique is a chilling chapter in the history of colonialism, one that underscores the devastating impact of absolute power wielded without accountability, and the enduring strength of those who, despite terror and brutality, refused to surrender their humanity. In the shadow of the Congo Free State, where the daily lives of millions were dominated by fear, forced labor, and violence, a small number of determined individuals began to uncover and record the horrors that Leopold I sought to conceal from the world. Among them were Edmund de Morel, a British shipping clerk turned investigative journalist, and Roger Casement, an Irish diplomat and humanitarian whose career would become synonymous with exposing injustice. Morel's path to activism began when he noticed an unsettling pattern in the trade between Europe and the Congo. Ships returning to Liverpool from the Congo were filled with ivory and rubber, yet carried almost nothing back to Africa. Suspicious of this imbalance, Morel began to investigate, piecing together evidence that revealed the systematic exploitation of the Congolese people. He realized that every crate of rubber, every tusk of ivory, was obtained through forced labor, violence, and coercion, and that millions of lives were being destroyed to fill the coffers of Leopold I. With dogged determination, Morel founded the Congo Reform Association in 1904, mobilizing public opinion in Britain and beyond, and using the power of the press to bring to light atrocities that had previously been hidden behind carefully constructed illusions of benevolent colonialism. Parallel to Morel's work, Roger Casement undertook his own mission of investigation, though from the perspective of an official appointed by the British government. As consul to the Congo Free State in 1901, Casement traveled extensively, interviewing survivors, documenting evidence, and witnessing firsthand the brutal methods used by Leopold's administration to maintain control. His reports, later compiled in the now famous Casement Report, were meticulous and unflinching, detailing the widespread mutilations, hostage-taking, and deaths that had become routine under the king's personal regime. Casement's writing was not abstract or distant. It painted the human cost of exploitation in vivid, heartbreaking detail, ensuring that readers across Europe could no longer deny the scale of suffering. His work provided undeniable proof that the public image of Leopold as a civilizing, philanthropic monarch was a deliberate facade, constructed to shield his greed and cruelty from international scrutiny. Together, the efforts of Morel and Casement exemplified the power of documentation and advocacy in a world where information was the bridge between hidden atrocity and global outrage. Their work was painstaking, often dangerous, as they confronted not only the logistics of travel in a challenging and sometimes hostile environment, but also the political and economic interests invested in maintaining the status quo. Yet they persisted, understanding that exposing the truth was both a moral imperative and a strategic tool to mobilize public opinion, create pressure on governments, and ultimately save lives. Through their writings, lectures, and campaigns, they transformed distant suffering into an urgent matter of international concern, igniting debates in parliaments, newspapers, and public forums that could no longer ignore the dark reality of Leopold's Congo. Morel and Casement's advocacy also highlighted a crucial aspect of resistance, that awareness could be a form of action, and that shining a light on injustice could erode the power of even the most entrenched systems of oppression. While Congolese communities endured unimaginable hardships under forced labor, mutilation, and famine. These two individuals, separated by nationality and background, acted as amplifiers for the voices of the oppressed, translating scattered testimonies and harrowing evidence into a coherent narrative that demanded global attention. The courage, persistence, and moral clarity they displayed ensured that the Congo was no longer invisible, and that the world could no longer accept the narrative of benevolent colonial rule as presented by Leopold I. The legacy of their work extends beyond the immediate impact on Leopold's administration, which eventually came under pressure and saw the end of his personal control over the Congo in 1908. Morole and Casement demonstrated that truth and documentation could challenge even the most tightly controlled narratives, and that moral courage, combined with meticulous evidence gathering, could catalyze global awareness and action. Their efforts remind us that confronting injustice often requires individuals willing to bear witness, to speak boldly against oppression, and to ensure that the stories of the marginalized are heard and amplified. In revealing the atrocities of the Congo Free State, Morole and Casement did more than expose a tyrant. They honored the humanity of millions and helped create a foundation for justice, accountability, and historical memory that continues to resonate today. By the early years of the 20th century, the relentless exposure of atrocities in the Congo Free State had begun to reverberate far beyond Europe and Africa, reaching audiences across the Atlantic and capturing the moral attention of the global community. Thanks to the meticulous efforts of activists and journalists like Edmond de Morole and Roger Casement, the world could no longer ignore the scale of human suffering, the severed hands, the decimated villages, the starvation and disease that stalked every corner of the Congo under Leopold I's personal rule. Reports, lectures, and publications created an unprecedented wave of international outrage. Compelling governments, religious organizations, and humanitarian societies to confront the reality that millions of lives were being sacrificed for the private enrichment of a single monarch. The pressure was immense, mounting like a tidal wave that could no longer be restrained, and Leopold's carefully curated image of a benevolent ruler began to crumble under the scrutiny of relentless moral and political condemnation. By 1908, this mounting global pressure forced a significant political shift. Belgium officially assumed control over the administration of the Congo, formally ending Leopold's personal dominion. The announcement was hailed in European capitals as a step toward reform, with officials emphasizing the promise of governance under state oversight rather than private tyranny. The transfer of power represented a symbolic victory for those who had long campaigned to expose the injustices of Leopold's regime, a moment in which international advocacy had translated into tangible political action. Yet for the Congolese people, the change was bittersweet, for while the machinery of personal exploitation under Leopold was dismantled, suffering did not vanish overnight. Forced labor persisted under Belgian administration, albeit with modifications designed to placate international observers, and economic extraction continued to prioritize European interests over the well-being of local communities. Villages continued to feel the lingering effects of years of violence, population decline, and cultural disruption, as the social fabric of the Congo had been irreversibly altered by decades of oppression. The transition to Belgian state control highlighted the complex interplay between global morality and local realities, revealing how international outrage could compel political change, but not immediately eradicate systemic exploitation. Policies were introduced ostensibly to reform the administration, improve labor conditions, and monitor human rights abuses. Yet these measures were often inconsistently applied and insufficient to address the deep scars left on Congolese society. Families struggled to rebuild communities that had been fractured by decades of forced labor and violence, and many regions faced lingering shortages of food, education, and healthcare infrastructure. The physical and psychological aftermath of Leopold's reign continued to shape daily life, influencing generations long after the formal end of his personal rule. Despite these challenges, the shift to Belgian administration marked the beginning of a gradual transformation, providing opportunities for local leadership, education, and social organization that had been systematically suppressed under Leopold. Activists, religious leaders, and emerging political figures began to organize more openly, inspired in part by the global recognition of the atrocities and the precedent of international accountability. Figures such as Simon Kimbangu emerged, advocating for spiritual and social upliftment, resisting oppressive structures, and asserting the dignity of Congolese identity. While the eventual movements for independence found their roots in the awareness and resilience nurtured during these transitional years, the persistence of suffering underlines a crucial historical truth. Systemic injustice and exploitation leave enduring legacies. But awareness, advocacy, and resilience can plant the seeds of eventual liberation and social reform. The story of Belgium assuming administrative control over the Congo is therefore one of both victory and caution, illustrating how international pressure can redirect the course of history, yet also emphasizing the enduring responsibility to address the needs and rights of those who have suffered. The Congolese people's struggle did not end in 1908. It continued through decades of colonial oversight, shaping movements for independence and social justice that would eventually redefine the nation. Understanding this transition allows us to appreciate the layers of historical complexity, where change can be both transformative and incomplete, and where human resilience continues to confront the legacies of exploitation. It reminds us that progress often arrives in stages, that advocacy and documentation can ignite action, and that the courage of those who endure oppression remains central to the story of justice and reform. In the Congo, the echoes of global outrage and the persistence of local resilience intertwine, telling a story that is at once tragic and inspiring, a testament to the indomitable spirit of a people determined to survive, resist, and reclaim their future. Even as Belgium assumed formal control over the Congo in 1908, the shadows of decades of exploitation and terror lingered over its people, shaping a landscape in which the fight for dignity, justice, and self-determination became both a moral imperative and a daily struggle. From this crucible of oppression emerged figures whose courage and vision would inspire generations. Among them Simon Kimbangu, a devout Christian preacher, and Patrice Lumumba, a charismatic political leader, each in their own way embodying the resilience and determination of the Congolese people. Simon Kimbangu, who rose to prominence in the early 20th century, understood that spiritual guidance could serve as both solace and resistance. Through his ministry, he challenged the prevailing narratives imposed by colonial authorities, preaching not only faith but also the inherent dignity and worth of the Congolese people. His words resonated deeply among communities long subjected to systemic oppression, offering a vision of moral strength and collective perseverance in the face of structural violence. Kimbangu's advocacy was perceived as a direct threat by the colonial regime, and his arrest and imprisonment in 1921, which ultimately led to his death in 1951, became a symbol of the risks borne by those who dared to challenge entrenched power structures, while simultaneously cementing his status as a spiritual and cultural beacon for future generations. Decades later, the struggle for political independence crystallized around leaders such as Patrice Lumumba, whose vision extended beyond spiritual guidance to the realm of national liberation. Born into a society still grappling with the legacies of forced labor, mutilation, and systematic exploitation, Lumumba emerged as a persuasive and articulate advocate for self-determination, education, and political sovereignty. His activism was grounded in a profound awareness of the injustices that had been inflicted upon the Congolese people, and his rhetoric emphasized both the moral and practical necessity of ending colonial domination. As independence approached, Lumumba's influence grew, rallying support among citizens eager to reclaim control over their land, resources, and governance. His election as the first Prime Minister of the newly independent Congo in 1960 marked the culmination of decades of struggle and the embodiment of a collective aspiration for freedom. Yet his tenure was immediately challenged by internal divisions and external interference, illustrating the enduring complexities and vulnerabilities faced by post-colonial states emerging from systems of exploitation. The legacies of Kimbangu and Lumumba are intertwined not only with the specific political and spiritual victories they achieved, but also with the broader narrative of resilience that defines Congolese history. Kimbangu's spiritual leadership nurtured a sense of identity and communal solidarity that sustained people through years of oppression, while Lumumba's political vision offered a roadmap for reclaiming agency and reshaping societal structures long dominated by foreign powers. Both figures exemplify how resistance can take multiple forms through faith, moral conviction, political organization, and public advocacy, and how such resistance, when sustained across generations, can transform despair into action and fear into hope. Their lives and struggles were inseparable from the broader context of the Congo's history under Leopold I and subsequent Belgian rule, connecting the brutal realities of forced labor, mutilation, and population decline to the enduring drive for justice and self-determination. The stories of Kimbangu and Lumumba also underscore the enduring relationship between leadership and collective courage. Both leaders were acutely aware that personal risk was inseparable from the cause they championed. Imprisonment, surveillance, and ultimately violent opposition were ever-present threats. Yet their determination inspired ordinary Congolese to persist in daily acts of defiance. From maintaining cultural practices under suppression to participating in political movements, advocating for independence, their efforts highlight how individual vision and courage can catalyze broader social movements, translating personal conviction into communal empowerment, and ultimately altering the trajectory of a nation burdened by the weight of colonial exploitation. In reflecting on the legacies of Simon Kimbangu and Patrice Lumumba, it becomes clear that the path from oppression to independence is neither linear nor devoid of sacrifice. Yet it is illuminated by the enduring spirit of those willing to challenge systemic injustice. Their lives are testimony to the power of resilience, faith, and leadership in confronting entrenched oppression, reminding us that the struggle for dignity and self-determination is as much about inspiring collective belief as it is about enacting political or social change. The Congo's journey, shaped by centuries of exploitation, terror, and systemic violence, was ultimately transformed through the courage of its people, exemplified in the enduring influence of these leaders who fought not for personal gain, but for the emancipation and future of their nation, leaving a legacy that continues to resonate across Africa and the world. As we reflect on the life and reign of King Leopold I, it becomes clear that his legacy is one of stark contrasts, a duality that continues to provoke debate and reflection over a century later. On one hand, Leopold's ambition and vision undeniably contributed to the transformation of Belgium itself. Railways were expanded, infrastructure modernized, and industrial development accelerated, leaving behind a country better connected, economically stronger, and positioned more prominently on the European stage. In Belgium, monuments were erected, public works celebrated, and his personal contributions to the nation's modernization were lauded as evidence of a forward-thinking monarch who sought to propel his country into an era of industrial and cultural prominence. Yet, these achievements in Belgium were inseparable from the horrors inflicted thousands of miles away in the Congo Free State, a territory Leopold claimed as his personal property. There, His pursuit of wealth and power manifested as one of the most brutal episodes in colonial history. Millions of Congolese lives were lost through forced labor, mutilation, starvation, and disease, and entire communities were decimated, leaving scars that generations would carry long after the official end of his reign. The Congo's social, economic, and cultural fabric was violently disrupted. Traditions were suppressed, and the population suffered trauma on a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend even today. While Leopold's name might appear in Belgian history as a symbol of progress, in the Congo it evokes unimaginable suffering, a stark reminder of how unchecked ambition and greed can devastate human lives when combined with power and racial ideology. This duality serves as a cautionary tale, a lesson in the responsibility that comes with authority and the consequences of prioritizing personal gain over human dignity. History demands that we remember both sides of Leopold's reign: the industrial achievements celebrated in Europe, and the human catastrophe endured in Central Africa. It is a reminder that progress for some must never come at the cost of the lives and freedoms of others, and that the stories of those who suffered must not be forgotten or overshadowed by the achievements of those in power. The resilience of the Congolese people, the courage of activists who exposed these atrocities, and the eventual leaders who fought for independence all underscore the capacity of human beings to resist oppression and reclaim agency, even in the darkest circumstances. As we conclude this exploration of Leopold I and his impact on both Belgium and the Congo, I want to thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most challenging chapters. Your attention and engagement are what allows stories like these to be shared, remembered, and learned from, helping us confront uncomfortable truths and honor the voices of those who were silenced for far too long. If you found this video insightful, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you thought-provoking discussions about history and its lasting impact on our world. By supporting this channel, you help ensure that lessons from the past remain alive and relevant for future generations. Thank you once again for watching, for reflecting, and for bearing witness to the complexities of history with an open heart and mind. May the stories we share inspire empathy, understanding, and a commitment to justice in our own lives and communities. And now, as we close this chapter together, I wish you a peaceful evening and a restful night. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry wisdom, reflection, and the courage to confront the truths of our shared past. Good night.